Welcome to the Way Podcast on FM 91.7 WHUS stores at the top of the hour. I'm your host, Bill Trofesky, and for more, be sure to go to podcasttheway.com. Now, my guest today is Gavia Baker-Whitelaw. How are you doing today, Gavia?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing good. It's a good afternoon today. Election just passed in America. You're out in Britain, right?
Yeah, I'm in Scotland, but I work for an American website, so I've obviously been hearing a lot about it from my coworkers in America.
Yep, it's been all over the news, all over everything these past few days, and it will hopefully be decided within the next day.
Here's hoping.
And you, speaking of news, you write for the Daily Dot, right?
I do, yes. I'm a kind of geek culture reporter and movie TV critic.
What's that like?
It's great. You know, I get to watch movies and review them. I mean, obviously, the vast majority of films and TV that comes out is not particularly good, but I always find something interesting to kind of write about, even when it's something that I'm not perhaps enjoying very much.
That's a good field of work. In the podcast industry, there are so many podcasts all about just reviewing movies in general. Like people sit with the groups, they talk about it and whatnot. So it's good to see you finding a job with that when a lot of people are into that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I have a podcast as well called Overinvested, actually, because unsurprisingly, I have friends who are film critics. So I started one with my friend. It's going pretty well.
So that's good to hear. All right. So let's get into it. What's our topic for today?
So costume design, I think, which is kind of why you asked me on the show. In addition to kind of covering pop culture and geek culture and stuff, my real kind of obsession is costume design in movies and TV. And I just started a YouTube series kind of analyzing various movies and kind of tropes that you see across pop culture to do with costume design, because I love to write about it, but video is really the ideal medium because you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Nice. And I'll take it in movies, we watch TV shows, the costume can tell a lot about what the character is, their backstory, stuff like that. Any good examples you can provide?
Oh, so many. I mean, the thing that I find really interesting kind of as a costume critic is not so much movies where people think, wow, the costumes in that look so great, which is most historical movies, which is also the types of films that get nominated for Oscars, but films where there's loads of information in those costumes that kind of tells you about the characters and the settings. So you see that a lot in kind of sci-fi films like The Matrix, which kind of there's a lot of like world building and symbolism going on with the outfits, and also films by directors like Guillermo del Toro, who are very kind of conscious of the visual world in their films. So if you look at a movie like Pacific Rim, superficially, it's like a very silly kind of Transformers style adventure movie about people in giant robot suits fighting Godzilla style monsters and saving the world, which is completely straightforward Hollywood fun, trashy entertainment. But that movie is just so memorable because every single individual character, including quite minor characters who barely have any dialogue, they all have really distinctive outfits that kind of tell you more about the character's personality and also just make it easier to engage with them. Whereas if you're watching, you know, an actual Transformers movie, basically everyone is just wearing jeans and a t-shirt, or if it's a girl, really tight jeans and a tight t-shirt, which is just not really telling you anything apart from that Michael Bay doesn't really care about clothes.
He does care a lot about explosions. I know that.
He does. He has his priorities.
He knows what the audience wants. They just want to see action, crazy, boom.
Yes.
You said Matrix. That's actually one of my 3 favorite movies. But don't they all kind of wear suits in that movie?
They wear suits. They also wear a lot of kind of versions of fetish wear and also kind of that like 2000s era goth outfit. And you have this kind of contrast between when Neo's in the real world, everyone is living this deeply dreary kind of late 90s corporate existence where you wear suits and stuff. And then once Neo escapes into the Matrix, he gets to live in this extremely cool sort of cyberpunk land where everyone gets to express themselves in these quite ridiculous, glossy black leather plastic outfits, which were terribly cool in kind of the late 90s and early 2000s. But it also really kind of marks it out as a comic book style movie instead of a traditional action movie, because the priorities are all about just looking as cool as possible, as opposed to kind of looking sensible. Because if you look at a Bruce Willis movie, the outfits are intentionally very dull because they want him to just be the kind of archetypal sort of butch man with no distinguishing features who has no interest in fashion and is just like really practical when it comes to saving the day. And that is the opposite of what you want for the Matrix. And it's just like there's loads of attention to detail from a technical perspective as well, because like that was slightly before kind of CGI color correction really kicked in. So there's like these fun little details, like the costume designer Kim Barrett sort of added a pale green sheen to all of the white shirts to make them look more like the kind of digital green color scheme of the Matrix, which is kind of different from in a modern movie where like you just add that in, you know, in post-production in like digital color correction. So it's just like a really interesting and good looking movie without being perhaps as like conceptually deep as a lot of the costumes in a film, you know, like Lord of the Rings.
Oh yeah, with the Matrix, I heard they do the green filter to sort of give it that in the Matrix feel vibe versus real life. And I also heard too that movie was very based off an animation out in Japan. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, it has like a lot of anime influences, particularly kind of cyberpunk anime like Ghost in the Shell, and also kind of a comic book called The Invisibles, which was, I think it was like kind of the mid 90s. And that was a counterculture comic that was sort of a lot more surreal than The Matrix, but had a lot of costuming overlap because they were taking a lot of inspiration from sort of gothic fetish wear kind of zone.
And speaking of those kind of clothes, I saw one of your YouTube videos on Mad Max Fury Road. What can you tell me about that gothic or that lot of fetish wear or what you mentioned in that movie?
Oh, so much. I love the Mad Max series. I mean, the first Mad Max movie is a really fascinating like place in cinema history. It came out in 1979, and that was kind of at the end of it was kind of in the middle of an era of like biker movies. And it is basically a biker movie. It was made on a really low budget in Australia. At that point, the filmmaker George Miller was actually a medical doctor. He was working in the ER in an Australian hospital, and he saw like loads of road injuries. And that was part of his inspiration for the movie. But he really wanted to be a filmmaker. So he like put together this idea for a near future kind of post-apocalyptic road film and hired a professional screenwriter to work on it with him, got some funding, and it was kind of partly inspired by road movies, partly inspired by the late 1970s oil crisis. And that's how you end up with this sort of like Australian desert setting with loads of kind of violent car and motorbike scenes. And the main characters are wearing leather because that's what you wear when you're riding a motorbike. And the fact that it's out in the middle of nowhere isn't really so much to do with like desert world building. It's because he couldn't afford to rent an urban street with extras. And that was like the foundational point for this massive franchise, which is now spun out into this kind of huge universe of very kind of politically complex post-apocalyptic world building that takes place in this deeply surreal and weird, like almost alien landscape. And by the time you come to like the present day of Mad Max Fury Road, that's like decades after the first film became this hugely influential movie in Hollywood that went on to like inspire loads of other dystopian movies where people wear leather. So by the time you get to 2015 with Mad Max Fury Road, they've kind of got to reinvent that. So they take that kind of biker aesthetic and like the fetish wear and stuff like that, and they ground it like a lot more, but they also have these sort of tribal elements in the narrative where there's different social groups within Mad Max Fury Road that each kind of have made their own costumes that have various symbolic meanings and that sort of thing. So the two main groups are, it's kind of split along gender lines because instead of it being a commentary about like the climate, it's more to do with gender roles. So you've got the villain who is Immortan Joe, who's sort of a very, very prescient Trump-like figure who's this evil sort of controlling dictator. And he has kind of brainwashed all these young men into following him in this really destructive way. And he keeps women as sex slaves, basically. And the heroes are a group of women led by Charlize Theron's character, Furiosa, who escape. And they meet up with Mad Max, who's the protagonist of the earlier films. But the women are kind of wearing these skimpy white dresses because they've not been allowed to choose what they wear, and they've been kind of given clothes that just make them attractive and vulnerable. Like they're not even allowed to have shoes, which is a really kind of key costuming detail. Whereas Immortan Joe is trying to look as kind of aggressive and macho and tough as possible. So he's got this ridiculous suit of armor. He's wearing all these kind of badges and stuff to make himself look like a military leader. And all of his supporters, the war boys, they wear cargo pants because like they don't have anywhere to store their possessions apart from their pockets because they're not really allowed any privacy. And they don't wear shirts because they're meant to just be willing to sacrifice themselves in battle at any point so they don't get armor. So there's all that going on, like in the costumes in terms of world building, but it also just looks amazing. Like that film is famously visually gorgeous. And you don't really need to be picking up on any of that world building to enjoy it because it's just such a thrill ride in terms of all the action sequences and stuff. So it's just visually a really interesting movie to analyze just in every way.
Yeah, I know every action scene, or even I remember with the guy was playing what's his name? Playing the guitar, like while they're in the desert, this fire is blasting everywhere, this sandstorm's coming. Oh,
his name is the Doof Warrior. He even has a name. They have a name for everyone in that film. And he's wearing a mask that's supposedly made from his mother's skin. So one of the details in that film is they've got loads of goat skin because apparently it looks the closest to human flesh.
Really? And that's probably all they could get in that post-apocalyptic world.
Yeah.
And also, it's crazy. 2015, I'm 21, and even I feel old now. Feels like yesterday that was all over everywhere. And so, all right, I got to ask the question, why did they incorporate fetish wear with a post-apocalyptic leather outfit type movie? That seems like something the audience would kind of like, too, you know?
Well, I don't know exactly why. Like, I've not seen an interview where George Miller says this is what I was into. But like, if you look at the first film in 1978, where it was more kind of in the just traditional like biker zone, you already had this kind of conflict between this sort of edgy, evil gang who were wearing leather. And then the protagonist also was wearing leather. And like, the actual kind of 70s, 80s fetish wear was very closely based on just like biker gear and sort of like police leather biker gear, that sort of thing. And because those characters are meant to be really edgy and some of them are sexually threatening, it kind of felt like a natural progression. And in terms of street fashion, that was something that was already happening in real life. So by the mid 80s, there's like films like The Warriors had already come out in the US, and Escape from New York and Escape from LA. So those were kind of also offering a version of that aesthetic. So I think it was something that was just sort of in the air in terms of what people thought looked cool and threatening, and kind of signaled that it's a movie for grown-ups, and also sort of an ominous vision of the future.
Gotcha. One thing I found interesting in your review was Furiosa. Her outfit is a combination between the Joe War Boys and between the what are they called, the Mothers? Yeah,
so like they don't really give anyone that much of a backstory, which is one of the amazing things in Fury Road. Like, it's very dialogue free, but just from the way she looks, like she's wearing this sort of wrapped around fabric shirt, which kind of looks like it was probably once the like white fabric that the women wear, the wives wear. And then she's also she's got a shaven head and she wears the same face paint as the war boys. So it's kind of hinting about what her history is, while also showing that she's sort of between the two gender divides, and she's part of like Immortan Joe's army at the beginning. So it's like a really interesting aesthetic choice that like sets her apart from the other characters.
What's the name of the character who he's one of the war boys but he becomes good at the very end? Sorry for the audience, spoiler alert.
I can't remember, but he's played by Nicholas Hoult.
Is there anything that makes him distinct or stand out towards the end? Because he's a different character among the rest of them. Is there any like hidden like eye trick?
Oh man, I'm sure there is, but I don't recall because like I made that video a couple of months ago, so I can't remember the details precisely. But he definitely softens once he like teams up with the main group of women, and you see him sort of wrapped up in one of their blankets at one point. But I think it's more to do with sort of his actions in terms of like the decisions he makes when he breaks away from like the main group of guys.
Got it. Okay. And well, actually, one more thing I wanted to mention way back It's crazy when you say that the whole Mad Max Fury Road or the whole Mad Max scene is this like apocalyptic desert world because they couldn't afford, they didn't have enough money to get guests and all that stuff you mentioned. That's kind of, it reminds me of like Jaws where the shark broke. So then
Yes.
they can't show the shark throughout the whole movie. And then that ends up making what makes Jaws so good.
There's like so many movie stories that are like that. I love them.
Really? Any other like big ones that I didn't know about?
Oh no, now I'm on the spot.
Like
I'm sure I'll remember one as soon as we finish the interview, but it's just like, I mean, budget constraints are often such an amazing kind of creative jumping off point.
It forces you to be creative. Like you gotta. Like that amazing movie Sharknado, I'm sure with their low budget, that's what made it so good.
I mean, it's certainly good in some ways.
It's like The Room. It's good for how bad it is, I guess.
Yeah. I actually did an episode on The Room that just came out.
Oh, really? I didn't see it yet. What can you tell me about that movie?
Well, like so many people, I've watched it many times. And for listeners who are not aware, I'm sure many of you have heard of The Room, but basically this movie is famous for being horribly bad. And it was made by this guy named Tommy Wiseau, who is very kind of enigmatic. He's from somewhere in Central Europe, but he's very private about where he's from, when he was born, what his real name is, and how he got like a bunch of money, because he had enough money to make a whole film himself, because his whole like desire in life was to be a filmmaker. So he like wrote, directed, and starred in this drama called The Room, which he also paid to be promoted in LA. And it became a cult hit in the mid 2000s. Because like when you watch it, it's just like this deeply shocking experience, because like you kind of don't think that a film can be that bad, and it's so bad that like it just becomes hypnotic. You know, the acting is obviously very bad because like he couldn't hire like particularly competent actors, but also as a director, like all of his ideas are like so completely unhinged. They don't make sense. The story is meant to be a romantic drama where he, the protagonist, is like struggling with a bad relationship with his gold-digging girlfriend who cheats on him with another guy. But his kind of image of gender roles and relationships is so completely like warped away from real life that it just becomes hilarious. And the costumes are a part of that because obviously, visually speaking, he's very strange. So in addition to kind of being quite cheap costumes, he's dressing himself. So his character is meant to be a banker because that's his image of sort of a like traditionally successful American protagonist role. But it's like he doesn't look like a banker because Tommy Wiseau has sort of stringy black hair and always wears oversized black suits and tank tops. And he kind of looks like the roadie for a metal band. And he's got like a very strange and unsettling energy. And it's like if you went into a corporate bank like full of American Psycho guys, you would be ejected by security. Like he looks nothing like he should. And he just insisted on wearing his normal clothes and having his hair look normal because he's an egomaniac and just wants to look like himself. And then his girlfriend character is meant to be like very sexy and seductive and evil, which is a kind of classic cinema trope. So he dresses her in like a sexy red dress, but it's not a good dress. And she's just kind of like a normal looking woman. So it just feels like a punchline. It feels really weird and silly and uncomfortable. And there's just loads of other elements of that film that visually look really strange because we've all seen normal romantic dramas from the mid 2000s. So we know what it's meant to look like. And the fact that the costumes look really bad and weird just sends like incorrect signals in your brain that just unsettle you with all the different characters.
So not only was it bad in screenwriting, not only was it bad acting, but even in just the clothes and the way it looks. He didn't nail anything.
Just everything. He hit every single spot. It's amazing.
I love I haven't seen that movie. I have to, but I saw a movie a few years ago that was based on that movie.
Oh, the one with the Franco brothers. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That one. And I love at the very end, they compare side-by-side scenes. Like, I can't stop laughing at the scene where he walks out on the roof. And I forget what he says, but like, gosh darn it, something, he throws the water bottle. And he goes, oh, hey, Dave, or something like that. You know that scene?
It's meant to be like a really like serious scene. He's like talking about domestic violence and then just turns around and goes like, oh, hi, Mark. And it's like, this is so inappropriate. Your social cues are way off.
Yeah, he's all stiff walking. And just, oh, that's just the funniest scene. I love that. I gotta watch that movie. I can't believe I haven't yet.
It's very funny, but I think probably wait until you're able to go back into cinemas. There's a lot of cinemas that screen it because it's such a cult hit. Probably better than watching at home unless you got a bunch of pals in your bubble.
Really? I didn't know it comes back, but once COVID passes and the theater is open, and I see that, definitely.
I mean, it screens regularly, even here in Scotland, so...
Really? Nice. Well, you know what? He was onto something. He may have made the worst movie of all time, but if they're still showing screenings of that,
a unique mind.
Yeah, I gotta make some bad movie like that. Okay. So I'm gonna bring it back to Mad Max Fury Road. You mentioned that religious attitudes or the way we view religion, or even in the movie, dictates some of the clothes, like some of the story building, stuff like that. So how do religious perspectives or views factor into the clothes?
Yeah, so in Mad Max, they have this element where the war boys kind of are in a cult. So they're worshipping Immortan Joe as a god. And you can kind of see that symbolically in their outfits. They're also really into motor vehicles. So they have all these accessories that are made from bits of cars and stuff. So that kind of gives you that like cult-like aspect. And I mean, there's definitely kind of fantasy and sci-fi films that kind of take elements of what they think will be familiar to the audience in terms of like religious symbolism and like incorporate that into the costumes. But sort of in a general sense, I'd say that like Hollywood movies are often kind of thematically Christian just because America, like the US, is a predominantly Christian culture. But like that doesn't necessarily play directly into clothes.
I could be wrong, but the majority of like big blockbuster movies are America based, right? Like you kind of mentioned.
Yeah. I mean, unless it's like in a fantasy world, big blockbusters are very American.
So what's it like? Well, Scotland, you guys speak English, but what's it like for the rest of Europe? Like, do you have your own movies that we don't see, or is it a lot just dubbed?
I mean, in Europe, yeah, there's American movies definitely dubbed throughout Europe. There's always like a few blockbusters each year that kind of come from individual countries in Europe. Like in Russia, they're kind of amping up the internal film industry there. So there's like more Russian movies, but I would say like the Chinese and Japanese film industry is like much bigger in terms of like non-English language, non-translated movies. But from kind of my perspective, I do watch a lot of non-English language movies, both kind of big, expensive films and also more kind of indie dramas. But as a costume critic, I mostly focus on Western films because I'm kind of aware that my knowledge is in like the Western sphere. And if I'm watching like a Chinese TV show, there's like, I'm going to have such a shallow perspective of that because I've not got like 10 years of worth of experience kind of looking at Chinese historical costumes and sort of the symbolism that the audience there would just pick up immediately.
Yeah, especially with the history. You talked about Keira Knightley, and that I'm going to bring up soon. But first, you ever see Parasite?
Oh yeah, love Parasite.
Yeah, that one. I see like Korean movies are starting to become I think it's Korean, but are starting to become big.
Bong Joon-ho.
Oh, okay, perfect. And there's even this new zombie movie on Netflix that I want to see, where they're like stuck on a train and it's gotta reach a destination. But Parasite, is there anything with those clothes that you can mention? Because I know there's supposed to be a lot to that movie, especially with the classes and like they're trapped in the basement versus the upper class living in the house, stuff like that.
I mean, I've not seen that movie in about 6 months, so I'd have to rewatch it. But there's a lot going on there for sure, just in terms of like all the visual elements. Bong Joon-ho is a very visual director, and he's made kind of other films that go like much further in terms of costuming. Like Snowpiercer is one of his movies that kind of was bigger in the West, like before Parasite came through and, won Oscars, because that film is kind of mostly in English and stars Chris Evans. And that film also is like very much about class divides. And you have all of this kind of visual symbolism going on with characters who can't afford to have clothes versus characters who are living this incredibly luxurious life and are wearing like ridiculous kind of post-Hunger Games type like post-apocalyptic outfits.
Yeah. I saw they released a black and white version of the movie maybe a month or two ago. And like the cover, how you're looking at the movie and one of the characters is standing with the rock, the other, like they're all just staring at the camera.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like the black and white shows the exact opposite, like from inside the house, and you see the underground family like come in the corner. I just love when movies do like do little like, oh, this perspective type stuff.
Well, the thing that's like really fascinating in that about that film, like when it came out, I was actually thinking more about the production design than the costumes, because the house that it takes place in, it's not like an existing house. They built that whole thing from scratch because Bong Joon-ho, the director, had like such a specific vision for what he wanted. So he needed a house that could be built for all the camera angles that he needed to tell that story in a suspenseful way. And it's like, it's incredibly effective. It kind of reminded me a bit of The Shining, where like the fictional hotel in The Shining was kind of intentionally designed to really unnerve you in a subconscious level. So there's all these kind of corridors that should go nowhere, but then the camera will cut and you'll be turning a corner that like didn't exist before. There's a really interesting video essay about that you can Google. I don't recall what it's called, but it's if you just Google sort of hotel layout, The Shining or something like that. It's just a really interesting element of like filmmaking that most people are not really thinking about consciously, but you really pick up on because everyone has a sort of internal vision of like where stuff is in the periphery of their vision when they're watching.
Yeah, not even just with like the hallways and rooms. I'm pretty sure in the background, didn't they like even move pictures in some scenes and like even faces and stuff like that?
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah, like just a bunch of stuff to like add to that effect. And yet, let me ask, like with the black and white and the colored movies, how much does color impact the outfit, or how much does color just impact our perception of what we're seeing?
So much. I mean, I'd like to watch maybe a film with someone who's like severely colorblind to see kind of what our different perspectives are. But like, obviously color is used in like a myriad different ways. There are some films which are going really heavy in terms of sort of symbolic color choices. So I have an episode coming up soon, which was about this film, If Beale Street Could Talk, which is a 1970s Harlem drama by the same filmmaker who directed Moonlight, which I'm sure you've heard of. Great movie. And it sort of has certain color palettes that go to certain characters. And also the overall color palette just looks really 1970s. And there are certain choices that like elicit certain emotions. But for the most part, like films, like mainstream films tend to have a relatively conservative color palette. And if you're looking at blockbuster movies, one of the issues in kind of the past like 10 to 15 years is that because such a like high proportion of the screen time is CGI, they're not as thoughtful in terms of lighting and color choices as like if you look at a movie from 30 years ago. And that's not to say I'm like anti CGI, because that's like a weird sort of Luddite perspective. It's more that I'm anti bad CGI, because a lot of big blockbusters, it's a situation where they're outsourcing to other kind of computer imaging studios, like often overseas, where the director perhaps doesn't really know much about the industry or isn't really paying much attention. So they don't have that kind of attention to detail in terms of the color palette that really makes things pop. Whereas if you watch, you know, a Star Wars movie, they have a massive amount of sort of in-house concept artists and that sort of thing, which is why, visually speaking, the Star Wars movies always look incredible.
Nice, got it. And Wes Anderson, doesn't he do like a lot of? I remember seeing a YouTube video where he's really big on colors and like with each movie.
Yeah, he's a really good choice. I am actually not particularly a Wes Anderson expert. I've seen a few Wes Anderson movies, but I can't really talk about him in an informed way. But he is famously very into making like pretty movies and films where there's just like a lot of kind of interesting kind of images that you can kind of enjoy, like a delicious cake.
Yeah, even and another thing is he likes to make a lot of his scenes symmetrical. Where like
yes,
yeah, it's very pleasing to the eye, and I wish like more directors would take their own approaches, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously love a visually distinct filmmaker.
And even with colors, you've seen Reservoir Dogs, right?
Many years ago.
Yeah, same. It's many years ago, but I remember like he goes deliberate with Mr. Orange, Mr. Pink, Mr. White. He just tells you the colors, yes. And I think there's a trick in that movie where they're trying to figure out who betrayed them. And if you look at the milk bottles in the background, there's supposed to be like 3 that are pink, 2 that are orange, and like 1 that's white. And the way it's set up is foreshadowing who the one that betrayed them is.
Yeah, that sounds like the kind of thing I can imagine Tarantino doing.
Yep. Not only that, but in one of my courses, I took an intro to film course, and my
Oh,
professor,
cool.
yeah, I love movies. I've always loved them since I was a kid.
Oh, I can tell.
Everybody does.
I can tell you're a fellow movie buff.
Who does? How can you not like a good movie? Come on.
Or even a bad one.
Even a bad one, like The Room, exactly. But yeah, my in the very beginning, they're all sitting around a table, and the camera's slowly like paneling between the characters. And one of the characters says, "I don't tip. I don't believe in tipping." And then when the boss comes, he says, "Who didn't tip?" Okay, yeah. Everybody's talking about who needs to pay, who needs to tip. And the character that tells the boss who didn't tip, like the boss comes, he says, "Who didn't tip?" The character that rats him out is the rat later in the movie, like the one who says he didn't tip.
Oh.
Yeah, like that's foreshadowing, because I was like, oh, look, he's a rat, so he's going to be a rat later in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
It took me a while to explain that.
No, I get you.
You mentioned CGI. The Mandalorian, I know they have a different kind of screen. Like, I know it's supposed to be some sort of, I don't know how to explain it, but you know what I'm talking about, where the back screen is curved.
Yeah, they like developed kind of the Lucasfilm, like Star Wars, Disney people. Obviously, they're always like on the cutting edge of visual effects because, as I said, they have these in-house teams and they like develop stuff that they then kind of sell to other studios. But the thing that's really big with The Mandalorian is instead of it just being like blue screen with a few props in front, they create an environment where it's kind of like it's like a surrounding IMAX screen that's like projecting approximate images of what would be behind the characters. So it both is good for the actor's performance because it feels more kind of authentic and you know what to react to, but it gives a more precise idea of like the color and like lighting reflections that should be kind of hitting off that like the character's skin or their costume or whatever. So it's a lot more effective than like attempting to correct that in like a traditional kind of blue screen environment. And often when you see sort of films that have like mediocre CGI environments, like the problems will all be to do with lighting and shadows. And like you usually don't necessarily notice it, but you can feel like something's off because the character just doesn't seem like they're there.
Got it. Yeah, because I know there's some movies, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but there's some where...
I mean, honestly, the Star Wars prequels.
Oh, they were that bad? They were the bad
I mean,
ones?
it was the early 2000s, but they were noticeably much worse than Lord of the Rings, where everything looks very real.
Oh, yeah, that movie's old, and it was very good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally holds up.
Good for them. And, well, last color question. I'm wearing a gray hoodie, gray sweatpants, and some moccasins. What does that tell you about my character design?
I would say that solidly means you're a podcaster.
There you go. There you go. You're obviously an expert.
I mean, I'm wearing gray leggings, a gray t-shirt, and a scarf. So.
There you go. The gray. Even my microphone's gray. But yeah, okay. So what are some of costume's biggest failures and costume's biggest successes in movies?
I love how wide this question is. In terms of biggest failures, I would say mainstream movies, both blockbusters and kind of just mainstream sort of A-list American dramas, not giving men very interesting costumes. Because like while in real life, women tend to be more into fashion and there's sort of more conservative gender role like expectations for what guys wear. If you look at what guys are wearing in like most films, it's like a gray suit or like a white t-shirt or a black t-shirt and a jacket. And it's like most people have colors in their wardrobe. They have a variety of outfits. And I think that's something that's kind of missing from a lot of contemporary movies. And when you like go back to the example I was giving earlier about The Matrix, part of the reason why The Matrix is such a massive hit is because all of the characters and Neo specifically look extremely cool. Like you can make a Halloween costume out of those characters and be like, I remember this character. You can say the same thing for Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones. But if you look at like any film starring The Rock, he is wearing the same shirt in like every single movie. This is also something I'm going to do a YouTube video about because I'm fascinated by it. But like also kind of just the ubiquity of like gray suits. So I would like to see like more interesting sort of personality-based costuming for men. And like, in terms of like issues with costume design sort of as an art form, I think there's a lack of appreciation kind of from things like the Oscars and also from kind of media coverage of films. There's a lack of appreciation for costume design in films that aren't fantasy or historical dramas, because it's very easy to notice the costumes in like a big sort of movie set in the 18th century, because like the costumes are gorgeous. You've got people wearing amazing dresses, you've got, you know, cravats, everything. There's loads of places to do interviews with the costume designer in Vogue talking about how much historical research they did. And with a big sort of film like Star Wars or like any fantasy franchise, you can tell they're wearing costumes because they're not wearing like quote unquote normal clothes. There's clearly a lot of work has gone into like inventing this world. But loads of work also goes into contemporary dramas. And like most of the time, if you're watching a good contemporary drama, there will be like some element of characterization going on in those films. And you don't necessarily need to be like at the Wes Anderson level of sort of over the top, like colorful visual effects to be making an impact. So I love the idea of just people kind of thinking more about like what people are wearing in contemporary dramas.
Got it. And speaking of contemporary dramas, what can you tell me about Keira Knightley?
Oh, so much. Yeah, I think she's fascinating. She is kind of the like the pinnacle of like modern historical movies. She's made like 30 historical dramas, and that is in a career of less than 20 years. Like she was technically a child star, but her breakout was when she was like in her late teens in Pirates of the Caribbean. And her films are like mostly kind of, they're very mainstream, like they're big films for the most part because she's a very famous actor. She always is like very beautiful in them. There's no real attempt to make her kind of look, I guess, realistic or kind of gritty or ugly. And a big appeal of a lot of these films like is that they are like, these characters are wearing gorgeous outfits. And I'm very interested by just like the concept of historical accuracy in general, because whenever like a big historical movie comes out, there's always kind of a lot of discussion about like, is it accurate, or is the filmmaker intentionally doing loads of research, which they will invariably talk about in interviews, or are they kind of intentionally going for something that's inaccurate on purpose as sort of an artistic choice? So, you know, a couple of years ago, there was a Macbeth movie starring Magneto, that guy, Matthew something. It was starring Magneto and Marion Cotillard in this Macbeth movie, and like it was more kind of atmospherically historical. You have loads of kind of battle scenes and fire and like gloom and ruins, but the characters' costumes they don't really look like something that's from a real period in history. They just sort of look like a dark fairy tale of history. And I think that like there needs to be kind of more flexibility about what types of historical costumes are praised and accepted, because meticulous accuracy is like not always the right choice. And also it's not it's not always real, right? So when I watch a TV show like The Crown on Netflix, which FYI, terrible show, very boring, but that show is like famous for how incredibly accurate its costumes are. Like it's done these amazing recreations of clothes that Queen Elizabeth and her family all wore kind of in the late 20th century. And the actors are all doing impressions of public figures who are quite well known in the UK. So we know that they're having to do like so much research. But like the actual narrative of the show is kind of turning these figures who in the UK are very politically destructive and kind of aiming the audience at an idea that they are sort of relatable drama characters. And then it removes all of the political context of the fact that these characters have, you know, benefited from centuries of slavery and British kind of imperial colonialism around the world. And then instead you're just focusing on the outfits. And it's like, is that accurate? Or is that just like changing the perspective so people are prioritizing something superficial over something meaningful?
So they're accurate with like the clothes and the setting, but they're inaccurate with the actual history?
Yes, exactly. And I realize I'm slightly off topic from Keira Knightley, but like there's a lot of Keira Knightley movies which are sort of in that zone. So like she's a wonderful actress and very charismatic, but at the same time, like she does a lot of movies that are kind of celebrating wealth and beauty and being like, this is a really feminist movie because it's about this woman like finding love and, you know, making her way in a really male dominated world. And that character will be like a duchess whose claim to fame is wearing like a gorgeous outfit.
And yeah, it's kind of speaking that category. I saw you mention your video with like actors like in general, but even with Kara, how much of their outfit is just trying to show the audience like, look, it's this famous actor, you know, or how much of it is actually like trying to hide the actor enough so they fit into the role?
That's a really interesting question. And it kind of depends a lot on both the actor and kind of the goals of the movie, because there's a lot of biopics where the goal is to make the actor just look completely different. So there's like a couple of Gary Oldman movies where, you know, they've really transformed him. Like they're, you know, Tom Hardy is another very transformative actor. You're slightly more likely to see this with men, but like not really. Like there's Charlize Theron she won her Oscar for a movie where they like very drastically changed her appearance. But like there's some actors where their appeal is part of their glamour, kind of like Keira Knightley. So you don't really want or need to disguise her because it's not that kind of story. Like we're all aware of who she is, and the fact that she looks really good is kind of part of the appeal of the movie. So it just kind of depends on the filmmaker's kind of attitude, basically. I mean, also there's some actors who are total divas and just always want to look as good as possible, which was definitely kind of true more in like the old Hollywood era. There's like the vast majority of historical dramas where just like, let's look really amazing. But like occasionally you will hear some sort of anecdotal story about like actors having a very clear idea of what they want for their costume because they like to look a particular way. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. Like it's their living.
You know of Game of Thrones. Have you seen that all?
Sure do. I watched the first few seasons and then kind of lost interest.
Yeah, you can watch up until like the last 2 seasons. So like the exact opposite. Don't watch those.
Yeah, one of my coworkers at the Daily Dot is like a massive Game of Thrones expert and was covering it right up to the bitter end. And by the end, I was just like, oh God.
Oh yeah, that was a chaotic month or even few months on social media, and I'm sure with your coworker.
It truly vanished without any kind of trace, which is a really bad sign.
Yeah, it doesn't exist. But yeah, you know, do you know the actor who plays the Night King?
I mean, I assume there's a human in there, but no.
Oh, okay, never mind. I was gonna ask questions because he's supposed to be known for playing. He's in the movie The Breath of Water. I haven't seen it. I forget the name.
Doug Jones.
Yeah, him.
I did not realize he plays. Oh, I love Doug Jones. Yes, I definitely know Doug Jones. Yeah, he's. I mean, I'm great to hear he was in Game of Thrones too, and I didn't notice. He's the classic you never recognize him actor. He's been in like Hocus Pocus and The Shape of Water, like every Guillermo del Toro movie, and is currently in Star Trek Discovery as like the alien guy. Love that guy.
The exact opposite of Keira Knightley.
Yeah, you like never see him. He's made a career out of. I mean, he has a very unusual body type. He's extremely tall and thin. So like he's great to put prosthetics on. And I guess he kind of learned more skills to do with sort of puppetry and looking like an inhuman monster while early on in his career, because he has done like every horror movie.
Yeah, no, that's a good career. Definitely.
Yeah.
And with like Keira Knightley, bring it back, or with those historical dramas, how much, or even movies in general, how much of it is realism versus pure entertainment?
Yeah, I mean, once again, it kind of depends on the filmmaker. And like, I think at the moment there's definitely like we're in a period where Hollywood is very into the concept of gritty realism without really examining what that means. So like gritty realism often just means like a really ugly gray-brown color palette, as if like everything in history was just really, it was like always raining. And just sort of loads of violence and people being miserable and a lot of focus on kind of like people fighting. And that is no more realistic than making a movie about like a bunch of aunties making cheese in like 17th century Holland or something, you know? But there's this kind of restrictive idea of what realism actually is. And it doesn't really necessarily bear much resemblance to what a historian would tell you is real. And at the same time, that kind of means that if someone makes a more lighthearted film, it's viewed as unrealistic. I mean, a really great example from recently was the film The Favourite, which was that kind of historical lesbian romantic comedy drama about, I think it was Queen Anne. hilarious movie, very weird. And like they have a lot of fun with sort of relatively authentic costumes and settings, but the way the characters talk is very stylized. And it's kind of a fictionalized account of like rumors of a lesbian relationship that like may or may not have happened in real life. And that was just having so much fun with the concept of historical reality that it felt like simultaneously a completely ridiculous, like out of this world comedy, while also feeling very kind of emotionally authentic, which is a combination I find really interesting. And like, I mean, my number one favorite example ever is, do you know the TV show Black Sails?
I don't. What's that?
So this is my favorite TV show of all time. It's a masterpiece. It is about pirates. It came out kind of in the middle of the sort of Game of Thrones zone. So it was marketed by Stars as like, let's watch this TV show that's about pirates and it's like all sex and violence. And like the first season is kind of like that. There was like a lot of kind of gratuitous, like whatever. But politically speaking, and in terms of writing, it like very quickly like improved massively. The writing quality is incredible. Narratively, it's very interesting. And it takes a combination of like real historical pirate figures and also side characters from Treasure Island. Like technically speaking, it is a gritty prequel reboot to Treasure Island, which is wild. And they cast an incredibly talented cast of actors. And the concept kind of philosophically of this story is that it is like a gritty political drama about like feuds between warring pirates and kind of civilians and the British Empire. But the focus is away from the types of character that are usually depicted in this kind of story. So the main characters are women, people of color, and queer people, and pirates and outlaws and political dissidents. So the kind of white male, like conservative power structure of the British Empire is literally and thematically kind of the villain of the story. And in terms of like costume and production design, it's not so far from Pirates of the Caribbean. Like it's not really trying to be meticulously accurate. Like it feels sort of authentic and real. It doesn't feel cartoonish, but like they don't feel the need to like do a massive amount of research because that's not relevant. And in the actual text of the story, they actually discuss explicitly the idea of what gets remembered and like the idea of which stories are written by the victors. So like when we look back at this historical period, we're looking at like who were the famous men like Blackbeard who got essentially news media coverage in England and therefore stood the test of time, and like which people were seen as heroic conquerors and explorers, which is the people who are writing history, which is people who were in charge of the British Empire, and which people were forgotten by history because they were lower class or they were women or because they were fleeing slavery and didn't have written history. And the story of Black Sails kind of ties up all those ideas in an extremely intelligent way, while also like just being beautiful to look at and having loads of kind of fun fight scenes like Master and Commander or Pirates of the Caribbean. So that is the thing that I think of as like my number one example of something that has a really interesting and thoughtful attitude towards the concept of historical accuracy.
Yeah, building off of that too, one of the number one things is the winner writes history.
Yes.
Whether like in like the war, whoever loses has to say they're the reason who started it, or whoever conquers say, oh, they wanted us to conquer, like everything like that.
Yeah.
And sort of building off of that pirate, what you were mentioning, Keira Knightley in your YouTube video, you said her outfit was trying to show that she was basically eye candy throughout the movie, right?
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily in a bad way, but it's sort of, you know, it's a blockbuster movie. And like part of her role as the female lead is to look pretty. And you can kind of also say that of Orlando Bloom in those movies too. But there's obviously kind of an element of sexism there because it's Hollywood. And in the first film, they have this sort of, I mean, it's relatively kind of drawing from that historical period. She's wearing this like beautiful ball gown with like a very tight corset, and it's sort of symbolizing how restricted she is by her life as like an upper class lady who's being encouraged to marry some guy because he'll be a good marriage. And her origin story is all about her escaping from that and kind of finding freedom among the pirates. And like her costumes kind of go on a journey. So like at the beginning, she's wearing this like corset, which is very, I mean, it looks great, but it's also like the point of it is that the costume itself is like constraining her. Then she gets kidnapped, so she's wearing like a classic sort of white damsel in distress outfit. Then the evil pirate kidnappers put her in like a sexy red ball gown. And then in the sequels, once she has more control over her life, she is wearing sort of a pirate king outfit with trousers, and it's like more masculine, but it's also very showy like the other pirates. So she has like a costuming journey throughout those movies.
And that's very opposite, I'd say, to, I'm probably gonna say the name wrong because I haven't seen the movie, but you said you don't like Guinevere's outfit and King Arthur.
Yeah, Guinevere. I mean, it's just very silly. Like, I'm not like gonna get offended by the 2004 King Arthur movie, but that's like the quintessential example of a film that like some Hollywood executive was like, Gladiator came out a couple of years ago. We need to get on this idea of gritty historical thrillers. So they were like, let's make a version of King Arthur, which like originally is sort of like a romantic fantasy epic about these sort of, chivalric heroes. And they were like, let's make it really gritty. So they're like, okay, he's like a Roman soldier and all of his pals are like covered in mud. And all of the guys in that movie are wearing these like really hefty suits of armor and looking really like tough and dangerous and unwashed. And then Keira Knightley's wearing like a leather bikini. And they're like, well, I'm sure that's what people were wearing in Scotland in like the 5th century. Like, I live here. Yeah. It's very cold.
Yeah, it's 30 degrees out. You're fine. The adrenaline heats you up, right?
Yeah, it's completely legit.
Yeah. Yeah, and also I like in the video I watched, you kept saying, okay, in this scene, she'd probably be dead, and she'd probably be dead in this scene. She definitely, like, throughout the whole battle, with an outfit like that, there's no way she'd survive.
Yes. Yeah. There's a lot of intriguing cinematic interpretations of like what armor should look like.
Yeah, probably not like that. One more thing about the history too, like realism versus entertainment. I like how Apocalypse Now and it's either compared to 1918 or Saving Private Ryan, both very successful movies in their genre. And I remember my high school teacher would just bash Apocalypse Now because as entertaining and great as a story it was, according to him, it's very historically inaccurate. I'm sure the clothes fit into that too, where like he just kept saying, oh, this was inaccurate, this was inaccurate, this was inaccurate, but still a very famous movie. And then
that's so interesting. And it really kind of shows, because like that was, I mean, at the time that was like not really a historical film because like it came out in 1979. So it was like 10 years after the events that it depicts. But a good friend of mine who is American told me like when I watched Apocalypse Now, because I was watching it because The Five Bloods came out this year on Netflix, and I was like, I should watch the movie that like partly inspired this. But my friend in America told me that her history teacher showed it to them in class and was like, this is exactly what it was like. This is why we all have PTSD. So it's like the different viewpoints that everyone has on their own like angle of events that they experienced is so interesting.
I need to find somebody who was actually there and just get their opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it was like not so far along. It's not so long ago, but that was the opinion of my friend's history teacher, Vietnam War vet, who clearly was, had a lot of issues with his experiences, as did so many people.
Oh, he was a Vietnam War vet?
Yeah.
Then I think I'd trust your source versus my teacher.
Oh, I assumed this is what your person said as well.
Oh, it said the opposite, where he didn't like Apocalypse Now because he was saying it was very, not like this or not like this.
Oh no, well that's why I was interested, because like they have such clashing perspectives despite both of them having like, strong connections to the source material. And I think that's definitely true. Like when you watch any or like consume any piece of art that's like close to your own experiences, people tend to have very strong but also kind of diametric opinions.
Especially when you factor in like books. Like people say, oh, this movie's not like the book. The book said this, the book said this.
Yeah.
Very critical. Side note, I Am Legend, completely different from the book, but both very good in their own right. And also, it's either 1918 or Saving Private Ryan. One of those is supposed to be so historically accurate that a lot of vets were saying like they need to take breaks from the movie because it was just bringing them right back to war.
Yeah, it may well be both of them. Like I've not seen Saving Private Ryan, but I've definitely heard that like about just kind of the immersiveness of like being in the war zone in those films is apparently like very, very alarming if that's something you've experienced.
I think they even gave a phone number for them to call if like any PTSD start acting up, but that could just be a rumor.
Oof.
So one more thing too, with Keira Knightley, their historical movies, you mentioned that political influences a lot of these movies and like their designs.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I was talking about earlier in terms of kind of like The Crown, By the way, I'm sorry if you can hear some sound in the background. It's bonfire night here, so we've got a lot of fireworks going off. um, but yeah, it's kind of similar to what I was saying about The Crown in terms of the priorities for mainstream historical dramas are usually kind of rich white people, basically. Everyone loves to watch a movie about the like royal families, especially in Britain. Like there's a big American audience, especially for, dramas about the British royal family. Also like historical figures who, once again, like because it's written by the victors, there's a lot of like famous historical figures tend to have biopics made about them. And in the Western world, they tend to be white men. So that's like a very political element of like how these characters are depicted. And then there's like, less attention is being paid to like every other demographic.
In Mad Max, you said that he wears the same outfit because it's a representation of him living or making the same mistakes over and over again. Is there anything more you want to say about that?
Well, I just think it's a really cool through line throughout the franchise because obviously they changed actors. And like in the original film, it's literally just Mel Gibson wearing a fairly straightforward leather motorbike outfit. And in the next two films, the whole world becomes like much more fantastical. And then by the time we get to Fury Road, it's effectively a reboot. Like the character is named Max, but he's played by a different character. He's played by Tom Hardy, a different actor. He's behaving very differently. And the setting of the world, it no longer feels like, oh, there's been an oil crisis and this is 10 years after 1978. It feels like something in the distant future where everything we recognize as human civilization is completely gone. So he's wearing this leather jacket that's the same as he does in earlier movies, but like more beaten up. But you can't really tell whether, is this the same character? Is it just metaphorically the same character? There are fan theories that it's like the grown-up version of a kid that he meets in one of the other movies. Like it just kind of adds to the ambiguity of the setting, and the fact that it's just this sort of mysterious fantasy world just makes the story more effective, I think, rather than saying, oh, this takes place 200 years in the future and this is what happens. Like you don't need an explanation.
Got it. Are there any famous or any big symbolisms in movies with like the outfits that come to your mind?
Oh no. So many. Oh god. Like every good movie has like thoughtful symbolism built into the costumes, but I guess something that like everyone would recognize when you watch the Star Wars sequel movies sometime soon, Kylo Ren and Rey's outfits are mirror images of each other from the beginning. Like the structure of them is very similar. And obviously they do draw somewhat from the Jedi and Sith costumes in terms of the color choices and that sort of thing, which are a prevailing theme throughout the franchise. Red and black for the Sith, sort of earth tones for the Jedi, because they're more like natural and they look like monks. But just in terms of the shape of those two outfits for Kylo Ren and Rey, they are like tied together visually and thematically right from the beginning of the movies, right up including the fact that like Rey is unveiled by removing a mask, and so is Kylo Ren.
Wow, I didn't even realize that. Any other?
There's a hell of a lot going on. I mean, I could talk about Star Wars costumes all day.
I bet. That's good to know they put that much effort into that movie, because I know they have a very big fandom or fan base.
Yeah, there's so much going on in every Star Wars outfit.
I think I'm gonna wrap it up. I think I'm out of questions. Everything in this genre. Yeah. Is there any final thing or any final message or any final idea you want to leave the audience?
I mean, basically what I'd want to leave people with is just think more consciously about costumes when you're watching movies. Like when you're watching, just think like, what do these costumes tell me about this character as a person? Like, what do they tell me about the setting of the film? What do they tell me about the attitude of the filmmakers? And it can really help you appreciate and enjoy a movie even more. And like, that's kind of what I'm trying to do with my YouTube channel, is kind of give people the tools to really appreciate that stuff and kind of decode some of the weird choices that famous filmmakers make in their movies in terms of costumes. It's just something I find very interesting.
Sounds good. All right. Thank you very much for coming out. And so the audience knows, where can they find you?
Yeah, well, you can find my costume design YouTube channel at Behind the Seams on YouTube. So that's seams as in sewing the seams. It's a silly pun. And I'm kind of discussing a variety of movies from different genres and kind of, ideas about costume design on there. I also have a movie podcast called Overinvested, just the Overinvested podcast, which is great, I like to think. And if you want to find me on Twitter, it's hello_Taylor.
Sounds good. Well, thanks for coming out, Gavia.
Well, thanks for having me on.
And this is FM 91.7 WHUS Stores at the top of the hour. And for more, go to podcasttheway.com. Oh, and also got an email or two with WHUS, the people that run this radio station. And if you don't see the episodes up on the website over there, it's actually about 8 episodes behind. So it's going to take a while to find the episodes over there. I'm sorry for that. Again, podcasttheway.com if you want to find up-to-date info. And as always, deuces.